Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we have, I think we finished a lot of the abilities from the Paladin. I think all of the defensive auras and all of the offensive auras are done, and most of the combat skills are finished. And we're kind of working on just what's left. Sacrifice is what we're going to be working on today, and Sacrifice is, well, it's an interesting one. I never particularly liked Sacrifice. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I thought Sacrifice was bad. And the reason why I thought Sacrifice was bad was, well, it was bad. I mean, it's not just me thinking it. It really was. It had a lot of glitches, and there were some issues with it. Most notably is it would often miss targets for no reason. There were a lot of, like, really stupid things going on with the way that the ability worked. Sometimes if a monster was walking away from you at the time when you use Sacrifice, it would often just, like, pretend like it would actually do something, and then it wouldn't do anything. A lot of those bugs have actually been fixed. So Sacrifice no longer has a lot of those crappy things going on with it, which if you in the past you used Sacrifice and you thought to yourself, wow, this skill sucks, you weren't wrong. But you might want to give it another try now because it definitely has been beefed up a little bit, and a lot of the bugs that were in, making Sacrifice so terrible have been patched out. So it actually works a hell of a lot better now than it did before. They also introduced a reducing of the damage to self on the ability as well. So not only now does it actually hit properly like it's supposed to, but they took the damage to self and started to reduce it as you level it up. So you'll notice that even though it starts at 8%, when you get to a certain level, it actually goes to 1%, and it starts to go really, really low. The damage to self is almost negligible at that particular point, and of course it costs no mana because it's a sacrifice ability. So in general, with this particular ability, it's great to use early on because early on the Paladin has like no mana. I think you start with like 15 mana as a Paladin, which is just awful. And being able to use Zeal any certain number of times past like 2 or 3 at early levels is just god-awful because you don't have any mana leech, you don't have any way to restore your mana's not regenerating very quickly, and it's just kind of a pain in the butt. So Sacrifice works pretty good in the early levels when you really don't have a lot of mana and you haven't found a mana leech ring yet. And the interesting thing about this ability is it does actually have a really significant amount of physical damage increase. So even just by itself, as you can see, it hits 690% increase in damage. But it has two synergies. One is Redemption, which is on the defensive tree, and putting 15 or 20 points into Redemption is going to net you a very nice 15% per level, which is going to get you all the way up to 990% increase. And then the second skill that it has damage per level is Fanaticism, which is down here. And Fanaticism is going to get you another increase in the damage output to 1090% per hit. Now, of course, if you utilize Fanaticism with the ability, you're going to get a very nice amount of damage. As you can see, I'm currently dishing out 4,302 to 5,600 damage, sacrifice damage, with an Ethereal Astrion's Iron Ward Caduceus. This is not the best weapon that you could potentially use with this. In fact, it would probably be a Grief. But the reason why I'm not showing you Grief is because, well, Grief doesn't show its damage output. The rather unfortunate thing about Grief is that, well, it just doesn't actually show on the character panel. So when you're utilizing Grief and you look at the character panel, it just kind of shows you nothing. Now, Sacrifice is a rather simple ability. It does lots of physical damage. You hit a target, some blood comes out. Like, it's actually kind of funny to watch. In the old version of the game, especially, like, this is one of my favorites, is you would walk up to a monster and you just see blood squirting out of yourself. Like, it just falls on the ground, too. Like, you can literally see the blood on the ground from literally just squirting blood out of yourself. And it also makes a very iconic sound. Now, part of Sacrifice's main issue is that it's really just single target damage. While it does do a very significant bonk to the target, it's still a single target bonk, which is not quite as good as a, you know, AoE bonk. Zeal tends to be the preferred choice because, well, Zeal just tends to hit more monsters quicker. Not that it does more damage, but that it spreads the damage out more evenly, and so you can kill more monsters quicker with it. Which, you know, it's not really like either here or there. Like, it's really just what people choose, and it's a delivery method more than anything. Zeal just tends to deliver damage better than Sacrifice does. If you're utilizing things like Holy Fire, Holy Shock, Holy Freeze, or if you're just trying to dish out as much damage as possible with a physical damage attack, Zeal can more often than not be a better choice because it's going to hit more monsters faster. Whereas Sacrifice tends to be a much higher physical donk to the monsters. When it comes to players 8, even in Hell difficulty, which is what I'm at right now, you'll notice that I can pretty much just donk the crap out of just about anything I come to with this. And this is with not the optimal weapon that you would potentially use with this build. Like I said, you would probably use Grief for the damage output, but this weapon still seems to work pretty well as well. And as you can clearly see, and I feel like this exemplifies my point quite well, is that it doesn't really dish out very good AoE damage. So in that situation, you noticed I was surrounded by a bunch of monsters, and it wasn't that I had any issue killing any of them, because I was dishing out plenty of damage, and I was able to kill any of them with relative ease. But I still had to go around donking every single monster to get that damage output out. And so Sacrifice kind of lacks in just simply the ability to kill multiple monsters quickly. However, it does have a very good single target damage, works very good versus things like bosses and whatnot, and it also costs no mana, which means that you don't necessarily need any kind of mana leech with this particular ability, and you can focus on things like life leech and other effects like Crushing Blow, Open Wounds, Deadly Strike, which is going to help out tremendously with this particular type of attack, and even other effects that might be useful, like proccing effects, things like Carrion Wind for stuns, things like Venom on Treachery, or Principle has Holy Bolt on striking, things like that. There's tons of different ways you can take advantage of an ability like this, but in my opinion, Sacrifice still kind of lacks a little bit over Zeal, just simply because the game's not really so much about killing one monster really fast, it's about killing lots of monsters really fast, and Sacrifice is not really good at killing lots of monsters really fast, unfortunately. It is, however, way better than it was before. And I know I said that at the beginning of the video, but I feel like I really need to stress this point. For those of you who have ever tried out Sacrifice in the past, especially in Classic or in D2 LOD, Sacrifice has seen some significant improvements with Diablo 2 Resurrected. And with recent patches specifically, Sacrifice was fixed. A lot of bugs were fixed with it, and it has generally just been improved to the point where it is a very workable and very usable skill. And if you would like to use or build a Sacrifice Paladin at this particular point, this is the best time to do it, because Sacrifice is at the best it's probably ever going to be. Redemption, which is the synergy for Sacrifice, is actually not terrible for this particular build either. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you actually are consuming a lot of your HP with Sacrifice, Redemption comes in handy as a swap to. So usually what I do is I'll put like Fanaticism and Redemption on 2 different buttons, so like F5 and F6, and then what you do is you just scroll between them. So as you're running around and you're dishing out your damage, you can just scroll between the two, pull up your Redemption, heal yourself or whatever, and then scroll back to Fanaticism. You don't really have to run Redemption all the time, and it's definitely not something that is, you know, wanted to be run all the time, because the item find barbarians and whatnot will yell at you, and that's generally, you know, They get angry. They get grumpy. Let me just say that much. They get grumpy. But if you turn it on when you need it and you turn it off when you don't, you'll find that Redemption is actually a surprisingly useful aura. It also looks different enough from Fanaticism that you're not going to mistake the two auras together. Cough, cough, Thorns, and Might, unfortunately. They do look very similar, although it's hard to tell them apart sometimes when you aren't used to it, or if they're both on top of each other even, then things get even more confusing because they both look so similar. Although Thorns does spin a little bit and Might doesn't. As for Sacrifice specifically, though, it does work very well with Fanaticism, and hitting the maximum breakpoint for speed on Sacrifice can help a little bit to mitigate the fact that it is one of those abilities that is pretty much just a one donk ability. You know, you go up, you donk a monster, you kill it, you move on to the next monster, and so forth and so on. It's very similar in a lot of ways to Charge, which has a lot of increased damage as well. Although Charge has even more increased damage and is even more of a one donk ability than Sacrifice is, if that's even possible. Although Charge does not have the beautiful no mana cost that Sacrifice does. And in fact, Charge actually costs way too much mana. It'll burn through all your mana relatively quickly for that massive damage bump that it's giving. So in terms of like how these effects actually, these physical damage skills actually affect the character, it's really easily quantifiable. Zeal is majorly the skill that you use when you are attacking something with a large group of monsters, or you are trying to proc an ability that requires multiple hits. Sacrifice is a very high damage ability that doesn't have any mana cost. And I think that's the main benefit of Sacrifice, is it's a 0 mana cost ability, which means it can be utilized in situations where you would otherwise have run out of mana. Like, for instance, let's say you are a Zeal Paladin. Well, you know, good on you. Zeal Paladins are great. But let's say you're fighting Bale and Bale steals all your mana away and you can't attack again to restore your mana. Well, just pop a couple sacrifices off to get your mana back. Sacrifice can leech mana just as good as anything else, and it doesn't cost any mana to do so, which makes it absolutely excellent for recovering mana or basically jump-starting the mana engine. Charge is the highest single target damage ability that Paladins have, but it also is a movement ability at the same time, and it tends to be very poor in terms of killing multiple monsters, even more so than Sacrifice, and it costs massive amounts of mana in the process. Vengeance, on the other hand, is the single target ability that Paladins have that dishes out large amounts of elemental damage. And I do have a separate video on that because it is a rather complicated situation, and everyone who builds Vengeance, I swear, every time they come to me, they always build it wrong. And it's really not their fault because the Vengeance skill just doesn't explain how it works properly. And so a lot of people think that they're doing the right thing, but they're actually going in the wrong direction with Vengeance. And if you're interested in Vengeance, I would definitely recommend checking out my video on that. But as far as Paladin combat skills go, there's really not like a whole lot of speciality here in terms of like which ones people like to choose. It pretty much comes down to Smite, which always hits its target, Zeal, which is used for proccing effects, Charge, which is the high physical damage single target ability, and Sacrifice, which costs no mana. And that's really the main benefit of Sacrifice over everything else, is just it doesn't cost any mana to use. It doesn't have better damage than Charge. It doesn't attack quicker than Zeal. It doesn't have a guaranteed hit like Smite does, and it doesn't put out elemental damage like Vengeance does. So, you know, if you quantify them in this way, you can really kind of understand why you would pick a specific Paladin skill over another. You know, if I was specifically trying to dish out elemental damage, like Holy Freeze, Holy Shock, or Holy Fire, I would not choose Sacrifice, because Sacrifice is not going to attack quick enough to apply the elemental damage the way I want. I would choose Zeal. Smite is also not chosen for that as well. Smite would not be chosen for Holy Shock, Holy Fire, Holy Freeze either, but it's for a different reason. It doesn't apply elemental damage, which is a limitation of that particular ability. And when you get into each individual ability and you start to figure out what they're good for, you understand better how to utilize them for your Paladin. I think that's pretty much it for sacrifice. There's really not a whole more to go over with this particular skill. It does the big donk, and it does it good. As always, thanks for watching, and keep watching.